Everybody. We are interviewing Jeanne-Pierre Smith, who is the Minister of Safety and Security for the City of Cape Town. And he has agreed to talk to us about the issues facing the province regarding land invasions, housing shortages, law and order problems, and so on. Is there anything you'd add to that? Your CV you think need highlighting pertinent to this interview?
No, I don't think you need to torment your listeners with any of that, other than to say I'm not the minister, I'm the mayoral committee member, and my jurisdiction is exclusive to the City of Cape Town.
Yes. Apologies for that error. So, first thing on our list, I suppose, would be the point where the two of us have shared an interest. About a month or two ago, I was dealing with the invasion around an animal treatment clinic in Khayelitsha, and I was called in to raise awareness about the situation and trying to attract attention. But as we mentioned before we came live, the structural issues with our justice system in general and with our legal system, according to the reforms that have been made, it's basically impossible to actually tackle these issues. How would you clarify that?
So I think that's a good summary. You acted for the person running that animal welfare or veterinary hospital in Khayelitsha, and they certainly one day found themselves surrounded by newly built structures, which was impairing their work. Not just was these structures impacting on their operations, but the people building those structures and selling those plots were threatening them, saying, we are going to make an illegal electrical connection to your facility and we're going to connect water. And if you don't grant us access and you don't give us these things, we are going to burn you down and hurt you. And so rightfully, they panicked quite a bit and asked the city for help. We responded several times to their facility, but in the big picture, at that stage, we were fielding about 13 land invasions per day on around 140 or 150 sites across the city, which way exceeds the capacity of our law enforcement to respond to every site meaningfully. Because, I mean, these operations take many hours. You can realistically get through about 2 per day per group of staff. And those staff groupings need to be 40 to 80 to 200, depending on the level of hostility and violence they met, because every land invasion is also met with one or multiple protest actions that turn very violent and that do not just target our staff to scare them, but target them to kill them. So our staff are attacked with petrol bombs and other things. It gets pretty violent. And your client, this veterinary hospital, did not understand that we could not daily give the site attention, nor did they appreciate that we'd had a series of court rulings that substantially altered the landscape and that effectively moved the goalpost to the point where the city was not able to remove the structures. So in South African law, under the PI Act, or not specifically the PI Act, but how the PI Act is interpreted by the courts, you're not, we can only remove structures if they are not inhabited. So that it's already an extremely high bar to set. What the most recent court rulings have done is to say that we're not, and the lockdown regulations, the COVID-19 regulations that national government is using as an excuse to further undermine these property rights, say that under Regulation 70, that we're not allowed to remove the structures whether occupied or not occupied once they're complete. So it is extremely difficult now to understand when you're allowed to act to remove these structures. The criteria has now been moved to the point where it puts a completely unrealistic burden on protection on private and public landowners. It's an extremely difficult situation, and many people, when they encounter these things for the first time, like Tamsin and the veterinary hospital did, cannot believe that this is actually what the laws of our country or these court rulings say. They meet it with disbelief and in fact are inclined to call you a liar when you say, look, I can't help you remove those structures because the law no longer permits it. They think that you're being dishonest and that you're not interested in helping. And it's usually a convoluted conversational process to get people in communities affected by these land invasions to understand what the law says. And that those conversations replay themselves in Welbeloond, Kraaifontein, along Marula Way, Bloekombos, Wallisdean, all over Delft, where hundreds of additional structures have occupied every piece of public open space extensively across Khayelitsha, Guguletu, Mfuleni, many other areas which have been severely affected, and where local residents who live there beseech and plead with the city to assist.
Yes, I think one of the things that is transparent looking at the situation is that there's organization which goes into land invasions. I hear a lot of whispers from various people how it's essentially a centrally organized process to displace vote in key districts, as well as to secure patronage networks and extract money from poor people who are desperate for housing near employment centers. But to what extent can you this general?
So I think on two levels. One is media reports that corroborate that, where journalists have interviewed people selling plots and who brag about selling plots and the money they make out of it, and talk about the prices they quote and how those prices vary relative to the proximity to electrical poles where illegal electrical connections may be made. We've seen a fair amount of evidence of that, and in the past there have even been arrests of people involved in that. We also hear this from the people when we act in terms of the PI Act to remove illegally erected structures, in terms of the Prevention of Illegal Evictions from and Unauthorized Occupation of Land Act. When we effect counter-spoliation, that is to prevent the structures from being erected contrary to the law, on land that we own or land where we on as proxy for the Provincial Government Act, and where people, when we remove the structure, say, but you can't do that because I paid for this site. I paid 5,000 Rand, I paid 1,000, I paid 7,000 Rand, I paid 10,000, whatever the figure is, for the structure. And I was on a waiting list, or I met this man and they sold me the structures, or this political party, specifically the EFF, is frequently mentioned, and at least one EFF member of parliament has been expelled from a legislature, or at least fled before he could be expelled after being involved in a land invasion. So there is a fair bit of evidence of people monetizing these activities and making money out of selling land that doesn't belong to them. And because of the incapacity within the criminal justice system, and specifically within STEPS, very little happens to these cases. So from the city side, we've started this by just simply in the beginning of the year, just trying to stop the land invasions. And it's maybe useful to give you some statistical insights so you understand the scope of the problem. And stop me if you don't want this level of detail. But in a normal year, we usually act on between. Okay, no problem. And stop me, Rob, if it's too much. But I mean, unfortunately, I try and keep these things factual and not just speculation. I want people to understand the nature of the issue. So in a normal year, we remove 10 to 15,000 structures, and that's pretty consistent with what Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, eThekwini, and others have to do. We sit in fora with them nationally, in SALGA, in IMPSA, the Institute for Municipal Public Safety, in the TLMPO, the Institute for Traffic Licensing and Municipal Police Officers, etc., where we exchange information, and we have a good sense of what's happening also in the other cities. So this year, since the beginning of January, we have had to deal with 63,000 structures that we've removed, and 56,000 plots that we've cleared. So relative to a normal year, we were dealing with about 15,000. We've already dealt with just on almost 120,000 sites, invasion sites. You can see that's a very dramatic increase over what is normal. And this is unfortunately common for election years. We had a similar spike in the run-up to the last provincial and national elections, when we saw that figure spike to 87,000. As you can see, it's now substantially worse in what has happened. And during this time, we have had to deal with around 719 land invasions. And in the first half of the year, the figures were pretty normal. But then in the middle of the year, there was a very determined, sustained, meticulous, well-resourced, and legally supported with lots of legal sponsorship or legal action sponsored by certain NGOs that then took place in a very coordinated manner with a very sustained attempt at occupying land, specifically land scheduled for housing projects, where housing projects were already approved and budgeted for this year. Which housing projects are now lost? We've lost billions, or just on 1.1 billion rands worth of housing sites, and slightly more than that in terms of industrial development, where land has been occupied and where you will no longer create that formal housing, but in fact are now, because of the actions of these persons, are condemning people to living in informal housing. So we've had to deal with 719 land invasions, of which 661 have happened since the 6th of July, the notorious incident where Mr. Bulelani Xolani undressed himself in a structure and then stepped outside, first with his ID card, and when the officials went in to go and engage him, then burst out of the door with them after telling them that he was okay to leave, and contriving that scene, which in some social media footage, which has been very selectively edited, then looks like something quite unreasonable action by the enforcement staff. But I can show you images of where that has now repeatedly been attempted since, in Valbaloon and other sites where we've had people attempt to undress, but we've gotten a little bit more creative or clever in how we respond to these matters, but more sensitive, and we have people with blankets and other stuff on site who can immediately go and cover them up, so that they are not able to expose themselves to the general public or to the media. So as you can see, a totally disproportionate amount of these activities have happened in just the last 4 months. And now we are tracking on average around 42 to about 60 land invasions per week. In this last week alone, we had 181 structures to be removed, 42 land invasions. So you'll see we're having a reasonable degree of success, 97 plots cleared. But in this time, we also saw 264 structures built that we could not stop. So as you can see, it's about 50-50. We're stopping about half the structures that are being unlawfully erected, and the other half now enjoy the protection of the new the regulations in terms of the Disaster Management Act and the court rulings. So under normal circumstances, around 2.5% of the structures that were built would remain behind. With how the legal framework has changed, the regulatory framework has now changed in these court rulings, we're now seeing a drop that has dropped or increased to about 50% of the structures that are built now remain behind. And at the peak of this, 2 months ago, when we were completely overwhelmed, before we completely readjusted our response to that figure had soared up to about 67%. So we've tried to respond as best possible. And these protests, as I said, get very violent during this time. In these protest actions, we've also had, we've done personally around 250 arrests of persons involved in them. We now have our investigative resources within the city doing watching briefs on these cases to see what SAPs do with it, so that they don't just withdraw the cases, but that there are meaningful actions. We've also started to look at the images that we've captured on site when we go to a scene and record, so that we can prevent false allegations against our staff afterwards, to just look at who the repeat offenders are. And we've narrowed that down to some 30 plus individuals who are repeatedly seen on these sites, getting involved in multiple of these land invasions. Just as a matter of interest, during this time, we've had an incredible number of our staff injured, around 82 injuries of our staff, 2 of which were attacked with petrol bombs. So that's not an attack to scare, that's an attack to kill. 36 of our vehicles have been destroyed or damaged, 4 other government vehicles, 16 private vehicles. And the situation has become extremely volatile for the staff, who really do fear for their safety.
JP, your volume went off there briefly. Your
All
microphone
right. Apologies,
cut
I
out.
didn't change any settings, but maybe our internet
there we go.
connection is not very consistent.
Oh, no,
So where did you lose
all
me,
right.
Rob?
By the way, you mentioned no, it was just a couple of words at the end. The idea was expressed, but what I know is you mentioned that there are a lot of civil society organizations, land activist groups, and I mean, I know a few of them by name, like Round Up, Kailicha Community Action Network, Social Justice Con, and Ndifuna Kwazi. Now, I know that some of them are connected to Society Foundation, which who also directly employs the CEO of the South African Human Rights, who were instrumental in lobbying the court to produce the 25th of August ruling, which removed the principle of counter-spoliation from South African property rights. How would you characterize the sort of network's strategy and the nature of the attention that they give these cases?
So, I mean, these organizations are superbly keen to suggest that the city is somehow targeting them or victimizing them, and have suggested that we are monitoring or surveilling them somehow. I just want to rid them of that vanity. If they get to watch your show, they must appreciate that they're not that interesting, and nor do we have to surveil somebody who self-publishes on Facebook and Twitter and your own websites all the details of what you're involved in. So between some of the CAN networks, the community action networks, who are clearly very politicized and very much in sync with their actions, Ndifuna Kwazi, Reclaim the City, Social Justice Coalition, Legal Resource Center, and various other affiliates, there is a fair amount of overlap of individuals who serve and function within multiple of these bodies, or have at some point been been through one of their academies. There are staff members who work for SJC and otherwise who appear in multiple recordings that we've made on site or that have been captured by CCTV cameras in close proximity to land invasions, where individuals appear or self-record or self-publish in relation to land invasions, where they're either involved in advising, instigating, dispensing legal advice, or in some form or other encouraging the unlawful occupation of the land or supporting the land invaders. And there is a very significant body of such evidence, which any member of the public can find by just going to go and search for such on social media. And the situation is that when you're, from the city's perspective, we have multiple encounters with many of these in various legal capacities, where they are taking legal action against the city, writing opinion pieces in social media or in various publications, some very captured publications which they directly fund. And after a little while of this, it becomes quite clear what that general agenda is and what the goal is in relation to property rights. So nobody in South Africa is going to be so tone deaf or obtuse as to suggest that we do not have a housing crisis. The problem is that housing crisis is not something that the city can magically make go away. We are not the sphere of government competent to deliver on housing. That is a national competency in conjunction with provincial government, and the city acts on an agency basis to spend such funding on infrastructure, underground services, water sanitation, and electricity supply, as is provided in budgets for us. So in this year, there was 600 million, a fraction of the money that is actually required for meaningful housing development. And due to COVID, that money got cut in half. So national government took some of its grant funding back. And it is an enormous challenge for us to dig or to take money out of other core municipal competencies like water and electricity provisioning generally, and specifically allocate that to housing development, which national government should do. So the persistent and sustained underfunding of housing development is quite creates this massive challenge, and that challenge is aggravated by the fact that the private sector isn't meaningfully getting involved in housing delivery. And the reason the private sector is not doing so is in part precisely because of these actions that people like the SJC and RTC and stuff are taking. The unlawful and unauthorized occupation of land belonging to some housing development entity of otherwise, be it Bosasa, be it the development in Steenberg, ends up with a scenario where the land that developers invest in, put in services in, put in top structures in, is so frequently invaded or disrupted or interfered with by political parties who go on site and attempt to interfere with tenders or construction sites or charge protection money, that the private sector just won't touch this. So unlike in China, where much of your housing delivery, all of that housing delivery is driven by the private sector in conjunction with the state, in South Africa, increasingly the private sector is walking away from this housing development, and national government is putting way too little resources in the pot to deliver on the expectations and promises made and the actual need out there. The net result is that people are then tempted to resort to other strategies, which unfortunately these same national ministers who fail in their housing delivery function then exacerbate and aggravate when they celebrate, in quotes, victories against the city, which is actually victories against the local community, with the land invaders, issue congratulations in press statements and appear in social media utterances supporting and commending the actions of entities when they obtain a court ruling against the city. This Minister Sisulu and others, Minister Cele, who goes on site and listens to a distorted version of facts from land invaders. This creates an environment within which there is quite a lot of politicized encouragement of land invasions by the EFF, by the ANC, and by entities who are affiliated, in many cases, to those political office bearers or closely linked to them, where the local funding sources for these entities linked to international foundations are also highly politicized individuals with close links to ANC office bearers or political activists. So it becomes quite a tight network of persons who overlap. In many cases, these entities have individuals working or involved with them who overlap with multiple other entities. And I suppose the desire is to present the image of a broad-based movement, when in fact it is driven by a much smaller group of people with a tightly packed agenda.
Yes, you mentioned sort of captured media and various people attached to organizations, attached to political parties who are deliberately issuing information about these events. Are there any particular details that you can furnish us about how that works?
I'm not very keen to get into the business of slagging off the media. I don't think it's appropriate for political office bearers to attack the media as an institution, but there are some media entities who I think have made themselves guilty of persistent misrepresentation of the facts. And you have a journalist working for a media entity that has now taken a very persistently malicious approach towards the city, and which we've had to call out on many cases and do right of reply to try and correct quite egregious misrepresentations, where a journalist or a correspondent for that publication will blatantly misquote something that numerous witnesses at a site or scene will say did not happen, where there's no police record of such, and where you can get no apology from them for writing what they've claimed. And that does later on leave you with the impression that they're less interested in getting the facts out than they are in perpetuating certain narratives and agendas, and are largely political in their approach and motive.
Okay.
I think the public know themselves. If you go look at articles written by some of these, and you go into the comment section afterwards, you see them being called out by many members of the public who are in a position to be less polite and civil than I'm being.
Yeah, no, well understood. Yes, no, but I thought one thing that I'd like to bring up, just because I mean, this might be a civics 101 thing for people, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the province has, what power the city has, what powers the national police have. And I know there's speculation coming up about putting local police under the IPID and reforms, centralization reforms, and so on. How would you sort of clarify this for people, the state of things and the reforms that are being proposed?
Firstly, we have for around a decade been calling for peace officers, municipal peace officers across South Africa, not just those working for Cape Town, because every city in South Africa has municipal peace officers established or appointed in terms of the Criminal Procedures Act. We have for a long time been calling for them to be included under the watchful eye of IPID and its predecessors, and there's nothing wrong with that. We would absolutely welcome that. And we welcome the oversight by the Provincial Police Ombudsman, because in the Western Cape we have an additional layer of oversight, which is the Provincial Police Ombudsman, and we collaborate closely with him and make our documentation and stuff available. So we're quite happy with it. But the rest of the Police Services Amendment Act is a bit more sinister and problematic. There was an ANC policy conference in Polokwane a long time ago, which essentially decided not just to wipe out the Scorpions, the specialized investigative entity, and replace it instead with the Hawks that directly under the control of the South African Police. But it also made a decision to try and preclude local authorities around the country from having separate police services. So this is problematic because the Constitution enshrines that right. Our Constitution is federalist in nature and has numerous strong federalist elements. There is a principle contained in it which sees attempts at devolving power to the lowest possible level and tries to ensure that local government, as a sphere of government, not a tier of government, has its own legislative mandate, as contained in Schedule 4 and 5B of the Constitution, and has its own, just like the provincial government, which has in concurrent legislative powers with national government around certain functions. So we've seen an announcement in 2006 that has slowly wound its way for the last 14 years to the draft or the amendment bill, that is the South African Police Services Amendment Bill, that is currently out for public comment, which basically tries to hijack Metro Police by national government, so that local government will pay for the Metro Police, but they will be controlled by national government. So we think that this is anathema to good policing. It's contrary to international best practice, and will make your Metro Police forces as ineffectual as SAPs. Because I can't tell you how many times I end up in public meetings where the public say to me, that thank goodness for law enforcement or Metro Police. We depend on them heavily because our relationship with SAPs is not ideal. And over time, we've had to step up and absorb more and more policing functions as those are abdicated by your National Policing Service, be it rail enforcement, gang enforcement, metal theft enforcement, liquor enforcement, marine enforcement, and other functions. And more of our budget is going into fulfilling something that is a crime prevention function that's essentially a national competency, while we are supposed to confine ourselves to traffic and bylaw enforcement, with crime prevention as an addition added to the functions of Metro Police. So it's become a very difficult situation for us. And I have little doubt that if your police services are nationalized or placed under central control, your municipal police services, that they will become exceedingly ineffectual and dysfunctional. There's this narrative managed by your national police force that says that, or by national government in their rationalizations for this attempt at creating this single public service. Because remember, there was a prior attempt at creating a single public service where all policing staff in the entire country get appointed by by national government, and all the local authorities have to use this the single public service, so that you can zonificate your single public service. You can't win elections at the ballot box. You deploy your political deployees to those administrations to manage them, and inject your politics otherwise. So that there was a lot of resistance against the Public Administration Management Act, PAM, at the time. And effectively, this single police service is an element of that. And the presentation done by the Civilian Police Secretariat actually acknowledged and admitted that, openly said that that was the case. So we have this desire to create the single police service, for the National Commissioner to take over control of your Metro Police, to appoint your Metro Police Chief, handle the discipline, everything else, and we will pay. We will fund it, but we will have no operational control. The city also has a law enforcement service, which we've been increasingly investing in to avoid the threat of this capture of the Metro Police. And the new act proposes to compel the city to incorporate our law enforcement into Metro Police. Now, these are at variance with the Constitution quite substantially, and we're confident that the Constitution will protect us from these attempts at gaining centralized control over these services. This is just one of many fights that we have to have with national government to resist the centralization psychosis that they suffer from. There is this attempt at gaining more and more power and centralizing more and more functions under national government, and all local authorities in South Africa are faced with this and have to resist that. And often ANC-controlled municipalities will plead with us, please, to be diligent about these things, because they're not allowed to talk about it, so they depend on the opposition-run cities to speak out about dysfunctional ideas like this, and ARTO, the administrative adjudication of road traffic offences, and so forth. So it's useful that we have some places in the country that can actually stand up and call these things out and try and resist them.
But this seems really bizarre. They are a and are conscious of a deliberate plan to subjugate the country to central rule. Then why part of it? I mean, I know document, and I'm an old former friend from the ANC Youth League who was the plan. All government bodies and local bodies under control of centralized people's councils, in imitation of the Chinese Communist. You've spoken to these ANC members on the ground. Why do they stick with a movement that they know is malicious in intent?
Because I think a lot of people do not have such deep ideological underpinnings. They're not able to see what the logical outcome of some of these decisions and narratives or policy positions are. Some of them on the surface appear attractive. I have a slightly more radical political background than where I find myself now. And I will tell you that maybe 2 decades ago, some of these narratives would have appealed to me a great deal more. But with age and experience and 20 years of local government experience, you do learn some things about what is practically reasonable and what the unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences, of some of these actions are. I mean, in the case of the land invasions do not make for happy, livable spaces. Every land invasion, far from the EFF says you must celebrate every time there's a land invasion. No, with every land invasion, you're condemning the residents there to a perpetuity of flooding, fire, high levels of crime, and an inability to render services because you can't bring services into that community. You can do in situ upgrades, but that's almost impossible because of the internecine politics, gatekeepers, and local warlords that make construction and development there impossible and play such community politics that these initiatives can't get off the ground. A good example is the N2 Gateway development in Langa that was started by Mayor Nomaindium Faketu in 2002, 3, 2004 somewhere. Now, some 18 or 17 years later, is still proceeding at an absolute snail's pace. And the reason for that is not political malice or political ineptitude or engineering ineptitude. It is the sheer political contrivances of people trying to plug into that scheme, densifying the areas ahead of where the development is at, and trying to plug into a housing development and manipulating those processes, sometimes in collusion with local political office bearers in Langa, for instance, to try and hijack those processes and gain access to opportunities they shouldn't be entitled to. Because remember, who gets access to housing opportunities is very carefully regulated by national government and their housing policies. We don't get to make it up as we feel in local government. How these processes work is carefully prescribed in national law. And so you have a lot of very untenable ideas that intuitively may sound to you, yes, people do need to seize land. Yes, land occupation. If you can't get access to housing, what must you do? But the violent and unplanned occupation of land is certainly not the answer. And the fact that national government hasn't come out strongly against it, taken measures to act on it, ensured that SAPs achieve arrests and convictions, and dealt with it more effectively, is setting the stage for a lot of economic failure in our country. This drives disinvestment, investor confidence, a loss of investor confidence, capital flight. In Cape Town, we have seen through Marikana and Welbeloond, large industrial developments that would have created hundreds and in some cases thousands of jobs lost due to unlawful occupation of land, aided and abetted by the actions of these court actions and otherwise, which have been very calculated and well-timed to paralyze our efforts at protecting this land, private and public. And if you think that the people on the receiving end are the haves desperately trying to protect themselves from the have-nots, that's an absolutely false narrative. The people who have bonded houses, as it is often called when people from Khayelitsha call me or Gugulethu call me, or even ANC councillors in those communities, pressurized by the communities who speak up. And we have 4 ANC councillors currently in under protection in safe houses because they've been attacked in the communities for speaking up against land invasions. So they've had their houses and offices attacked or burnt out, and are currently under some form of protection. This whole situation has become very dangerous, and it has been very amply aided and abetted by national government through their inaction and the double speak that they engage in. And we are losing opportunities all the time to build formal, structured housing with long-term desirable futures and outcomes for people. And instead, people are assisting and enabling short-term land grabs where people will live in very difficult and trying circumstances for a very long time. And those situations are not easy to turn around. It's not that you have a land invasion and you can now rapidly go and turn that land invasion around and create formal structures. Look at Langa. Go look at that, the structures along the N2 and how long that has taken. And that is a well-funded project, which is now many years overdue, where the city is incurring substantial penalty fees to try and complete that project. That's an simply untenable situation. So land that's occupied stays occupied in perpetuity. And I see in the question column, people are asking, what about land that has been occupied? The court order says we must go get court eviction applications for these. Well, that's simply untenable. We're dealing with eviction applications now that we made application for in the beginning of the year. The court simply can't process this. And it is untenable to think that you're going to have the courts issue eviction applications for all this land. So the mayor has instructed the city manager and the senior staff in the city where land of the city has been unlawfully occupied to apply for eviction applications, and those processes are underway. And residents in those areas will be delighted, which includes the Khayelitsha initiation site, where that Khayelitsha community at one point physically went to go and fight with land invaders on site to protect the site. And in other communities where councillors and communities called for assistance and law enforcement, and when we couldn't get there fast enough, physically went and broke down the structures themselves, just to make sure that people wouldn't occupy them indefinitely. But we won't get any eviction applications granted without giving alternative land to people, emergency accommodation. And that effectively means that you're queue jumping your legitimate housing waiting lists, which people are sitting on. We are currently dealing with giving housing to people who've been on those lists since the 90s. And the reason that that list doesn't get shorter is because you're continuously pushing in people at the top. And how are you pushing them in? Through these court applications, which tell us we must give people alternative housing. And that alternative emergency housing soaks up new opportunities, which housing opportunities being created where people who have legitimate expectation for housing, who meet the housing requirements of the policies, are then denied the opportunities. And if I were them, I would be very angry and very bitter. But they are very angry and very bitter. And you see this manifesting in new political movements with a strong racial narrative underpinning it. And none of that is good for the future of South Africa.
Yeah. That I was about to bring that up. Actually, the narrative forming that it's prioritization of migrants from Nguni areas over the coloured minority. But yeah, as you well put it, it's a very dangerous racial narrative. Personally, I do see a growth in that. There's a question here that I would like to address the audience. One is by what the let me see if I can bring it up on the screen. Oh, bugger. No. There we go. Land grab are also recording is what is the backstory?
Same as with all the other sites, same as with all the land invasions in Khayelitsha, in Kraaifontein, in Dunoon. People are invading land repeatedly and on a regular basis. So several times a week, there are attempts to build structures on land that is either scheduled as biodiversity or nature conservation land. The whole of the Driftsunds Nature Reserve has now been invaded and is lost in perpetuity. And so especially where Sandparks is responsible for land, they're quite weak with defending their land, and much of that land has been lost. I mean, the EFF saw that the city was very effective in blocking land occupation at the Driftsunds sites and went to court to get the city removed from the court order so that we couldn't act on the court order anymore. And Sandparks failed to defend that action, and so the city was left unable to act on that. So the land invaders had a good idea of who was acting and who wasn't, and how to stop us. And so you find a situation where the communities complain, the residents in these spaces complain, they want public open space. As one of the ANC councillors said in a portfolio committee meeting, we don't want our open spaces lost to land invaders because we need those spaces for schools, clinics, community amenities that allow for living room, allow for people to have recreational space and quality of life enhancements, so that all space in communities that were previously disadvantaged isn't just occupied with wall-to-wall housing and no opportunities for economic development, for businesses, for recreation hubs, for amenities. That can't be. And so councillors and many communities, whether ANC or DA or otherwise, do speak out about the land invasions because they understand what it means. And they understand the consequences of the unlawful occupation of land. And so Hout Bay is an example where this is just extremely persistent, whether it's up against the Sentinel or into the back of the Donchiyake or Mandela Park areas in Imizama Yetu. It's just persistent and daily. And we get to them as often as we can, in as much as we have support from SAPS, keeping in mind that we've been significantly disadvantaged with very low levels of SAPS resources in this city and this province compared to the national average. We also have been given less public order policing units than other areas. So when the inevitable protest actions erupt in tandem with the land invasions, it's very hard for the city to effectively deal with all of those. And those protest actions are calculated to prevent us from taking counter spoliation operations and to prevent the structures from being erected or from being too scared to act because of the possible consequences and outcomes of taking those lawful actions. Out Bay is an example of where this has just been a slow incremental creep of illegal building, and many of the others the same. And I just want to say, Rob, at the heart of this lies the dysfunctional PI Act, a piece of national legislation that national government knows is broken, has been told is broken by SALGA, the South African Local Government Association, which is ANC controlled. SALGA even has a working group to try and deal with the land invasions, because your local authorities, whilst by and large governed by the same ideology as national government, are facing the crisis created by these land invasions and trying to find ways out of them, and also getting very little help from the state nationally.
From Phil Craig. He asks, he says that Professor Koos Milan says it's impossible to get an ideologically fair judgment at Concord. Do you think that any of through the Concord consider ideological predilections?
I don't want to comment on Concord so much. I mean, but I do think that we have a growing problem with political deployees in courts. We have seen court rulings that have been ridiculed by the rest of the legal fraternity in relation to the street people cases, Gelderblom and others in the city, and the tented camp on Observatory Main Road, the SAHRC ruling. We've had rulings where the city and the petitioners of the court have come to an agreement, and where the judges turned around and said, I'm not interested in your mutually reached agreement, I'm going to impose my own order here. So we have rulings which the rest of the legal fraternity really just shake their heads at in disbelief. And some of the most recent court rulings are just diabolical. They're bereft of fairness. They blatantly ignore much of the evidence presented to them. And I think we're finding it very difficult in the Western Cape High Court specifically. I think you find the worst examples of this very sustained political and ideological bias against the city and the provincial government, with judges whose rulings I think a lot of people are finding great difficulty in making sense of. And it's not appropriate for, again, a public office bearer to criticize our courts. We must protect the institution of the courts. So I don't want to be too critical, but I don't think I have to explain this to the public. I think they're seeing it for themselves. I go to public meetings and members of the public unpack for me what they think is going on with the courts and the judgments. I don't think anybody in South Africa is missing what's going on here and how this is working. So it's one of the many things which, fortunately, by and large, the public are awake enough to detect and unpack and disentangle for themselves.
Well, now I'm going to be an extraordinary pessimist for a minute. So the DA seems highly unlikely to gain a majority nationally. The legislative route to fixing these problems seems closed off. As you say, there's a lot of capture of the court system, whether ideologically or materially, and you face a highly organized and centralized hostility and from a political force that's implacably opposed to you. A lot of people have suggested the solution of national secession, which, while I have a romantic attachment to myself, I recognize has a lot of rather frightening dimensions to it. Okay. Everyone, I don't know if that was I don't know if that was a technical issue. I know that the connection on the other end has been a little bit dodgy. But we are very our hour, and I will we will see. Tomorrow we have Rian Sali on tomorrow evening to talk to us about various issues, both local and national, hopefully about liberalism and so on. Hope you all have a good rest of the day.